CrossCode is a 2D role-playing game that combines classic RPG systems with puzzles that are on the level of the Legend of Zelda series, all backed by intense combat and a retro 16-bit style. It's set in the world of Crossworlds, a highly popular and sprawling virtual reality MMO. You are Leia, a Crossworlds player who just happens to be a little different from the rest. She's lost her memory, and the only hope of retrieving it is by playing the MMO, exploring the vast Crossworlds map, and meeting other players along the way. And due to an issue with her speech module, Leia is effectively mute, which makes socializing a little difficult for her. Now, throughout the game, very basic words will be hard-coded into her avatar, and this often serves as comic relief. As with any RPG, what begins as a simple task will soon turn into an emotional story filled with mystery, intrigue, and action. Shadoon, which is the world of Crossworlds, is extremely varied, and each of the 7 major locations you visit all look and sound different, from the greenery and bright colors of Autumn's Rise to the deserts of Maroon Valley and more. CrossCode's 16-bit SNES-style graphics do not in any way detract from the variety or the beauty of the game's locations. In fact, the graphics are used to great effect when creating the dizzying heights of a mountaintop or the epic views only found on a bridge suspended over the sea. As a game set inside a game, CrossCode is filled with gaming references that are always good for a laugh. So for example, you can come across a group of players complaining about Crossworlds updates taking too long to come out, or players waiting for their friends to log in so they can go on a dungeon crawl. Other players lament the difficulty of a dungeon or a boss, and so much more. And these meta comments are often good for a quick chuckle, but they also make the world feel a little more real. I mean, haven't we all been disappointed by patch notes before, or waited a really long time for a friend to log in? You control Leia from a top-down perspective as you explore Shadoon, and you'll be splitting your time between combat and exploration mostly. As with most classic RPGs, the game's world can really be seen in 2 parts, an overworld and the dungeons. But before going any further, combat should be discussed first because it is a major part of CrossCode. It also happens to be an incredibly smooth and fun experience. To begin with, Leia's character class in the game is a Spheromancer, and that just basically means that on top of normal physical attacks, players can launch projectiles at enemies, and these balls also serve as an essential puzzle-solving tool since they can ricochet off walls and activate distance switches. On the overworld map, combat is usually initiated by the player. Enemies can be seen roaming around, but most won't attack unless provoked, and this can be advantageous to players who want to explore unhindered by battles, or those who feel a little underpowered for the current area. Combat is often a challenging and brutal affair. Enemies deal a lot of damage really quickly, and it's important to master their attack patterns and the telltale signs of upcoming powerful attacks if you hope to defeat them. Although it may seem at first that combat in CrossCode is simply a button-mashing affair, and you'd be excused for thinking that, it really isn't. Although that tactic might work early on or when you're fighting enemies much weaker than yourself, it's usually better to employ all the skills in Leia's repertoire. The 4 most defensive techniques are dashing and guarding. Dashing away from an enemy's attack at just the right moment can save you from heavy damage and leave the opponent open to attack. And if dodging isn't an option, pulling up the shield to block some incoming damage can work as well. For offense, Leia can keep her distance from enemies and shoot the aforementioned balls, or run up to opponents and engage in melee combat. Combining offensive and defensive tactics while dodging enemy attacks makes for a decent combat experience, and if that was all there was to CrossCode's combat, it would be alright. But there is a little bit more to it. Combat arts are special techniques that you can learn over the course of the game to add a little more strategy to combat and personalize Leia's skills to fit your playstyle. Would you like to unleash a spinning attack that deals high damage to multiple enemies? Would you rather dash in a straight line and slash all enemies on your path? Or would you rather hold up your shield and unleash a shockwave that damages and pushes back enemies? Now, those are just some of the many combat arts that Leia can learn. As you complete dungeons, you'll gain access to elemental powers. And these powers, which can be activated at the touch of a button, modify your physical and ranged attacks. So for example, if you activate the heat element, well, you'll be shooting fireballs and burning enemies with flaming slashes. Overall, combat in the game is challenging. It isn't necessarily Souls-like, but many enemies, especially bosses, will ask a lot of you. It isn't enough to just know how to attack and defend. You need to learn how the enemy attacks, and have quick reflexes to avoid massive damage. In particular, bosses can quickly turn into a bullet hell of epic proportions. Being a role-playing game, of course you'll soon find yourself with a partner or 2 in your party. And in combat, party members act autonomously based on your preferences. So would you rather party members attack the same enemy as you, or concentrate on other opponents while you focus on one? Do you want them to use their combat arts all the time, never, or at reasonable intervals? Well, all that and more can be customized. Now as for dungeons, they work a little differently. First of all, enemies attack on sight. And secondly, in the game's lore, all dungeons are instanced, which means that you will be dungeon diving by yourself and thus will not be able to rely on the assistance of party members. The overworld is where you'll find quests, fight most of the monsters, search for treasure, and interact with NPCs. As you explore, you'll defeat enemies for experience and loot, discover hidden items and destructible plants, and find treasure chests. Every location in the game features hidden paths or traversal puzzles that you have to work out in order to reach chests containing valuable gear and items. Exploration is a big part of CrossCode, not only because it's fun, but because a lot of the items you'll pick up can later be used to trade with merchants or just sold outright for money. Of course, there is another way to gain items, money, and experience through side quests. CrossCode is filled with NPCs who will readily offer you work in return for money and items. These side quests range from simple fetch quests to tests of your parkour or combat abilities, and more. To say that there are a lot of side quests in the game is an understatement. Generally speaking, they're usually fun and don't detract from the main game. However, it has to be said that they can get a little overwhelming, especially in the beginning when players have no real knowledge of the world's locations or enemy names. So for example, an early side quest has you leaving the initial location, Rookie Harbor, to heal sick trees in Autumn's Rise. Now the quest log tells you to look for trees in Pathway 2, Pathway 3, Off-Road 2, and Obelisk Lake. But unless you think to open up your map and see if the screens have names, you'll be searching for a long time. That isn't to say that the side quests are bad. Once you get the hang of the game's mechanics, they can be great ways to add to your riches, your gear, or your experience. Even early in the game, you will have an extensive backlog of side quests to complete, which means that you'll rarely have nothing to do. Dungeons are a whole other beast. These extensive sections are crucibles of combat and puzzles that will test your problem-solving skills and your patience. Developer Radical Fish describes CrossCode as one part Zelda, and that influence clearly shows in the dungeons. Every room on every floor in every dungeon is either a puzzle room, a combat room, or both. Dungeons are themed, such as a temple mine which is themed around heat and the use of fire. And anybody who's played almost any entry in the Legend of Zelda series will immediately feel at home in dungeons. For example, one particular puzzle in the temple mine requires players to position pillars around a room in order to hit several targets and a switch in a particular order. As stated previously in this review, these puzzles are where Leia's projectiles really shine. Almost every puzzle requires the use of her Spheromancer ability. Even unlocking doors requires a projectile. Once you have a door key, you have to stand on a key block and fire at the lock. As you advance in dungeons, you'll fight mini-bosses, collect keys, acquire new abilities, and eventually fight the dungeon's boss. Because dungeons are solo affairs, you'll be unable to rely on your party members for assistance. So in other words, before embarking on a dungeon, it's wise to grind out as many levels as you can and purchase or find better equipment. The only real issue I have with CrossCode is the circuit system. So as you level up, you gain circuit points, which can then be used in the circuit board to purchase upgrades such as increased strength or new combat arts. The best comparison I can think of is Final Fantasy X's sphere system. Now the circuit board is composed of many circuits that are arranged in a lozenge, and each path offers its own advantages. So for example, one path focuses on strength, another focuses on defense. Now this is simple enough, but the complication comes from the fact that you can only activate one branch at a time. And it can be difficult to precisely determine what perks are in a branch, especially if they're near the beginning of another one. It also means that you'll often have to open up the circuit board and select which branch you want to activate based on the situation. And moreover, branches contain certain combat arts, but you can only have one of each type of combat art active at a time. And you can swap the active arts, but it can quickly get confusing. The whole thing gets even more convoluted when you begin clearing dungeons and gaining additional circuit boards based on the different elements. When that happens, you'll be selecting active boards and branches while swapping through arts. And that whole thing just gets quickly overwhelming and can slow you down as you pause the game to change up your style. If you're wondering if CrossCode is the game for you, then try and think back to the days of classic role-playing on the SNES, for example. Do you replay games like A Link to the Past? Do you like a challenge? Then yes, absolutely, this is a game for you. Just keep in mind that CrossCode was built with challenge in mind, so do expect to die frequently and to scratch your head during some puzzle moments. Of course, if you aren't comfortable with the game's difficulty, there are options to tone down the amount of damage enemies inflict, as well as to reduce the frequency of their attacks. Now, this can really help a new player or somebody who isn't used to these types of challenges to enjoy the game. CrossCode is a game that clearly has had a lot of time and passion put into it. The game is smooth, combat is fantastic and rewarding, the puzzles are well thought out and challenging, and the game itself is beautiful. It does take some time to get into the rhythm of things, but once you do get a good grasp, you're in for a damn good ride.